Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Pentagon, where we're meeting with Shah, the Managing Director of the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. He is an Air Force reservist that's currently serving in California, correct?
Correct.
Fantastic. Sir, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I want to start, obviously, this innovation and the entire agenda has been a priority for this administration. It's been very, very important to Dr. Carter as a theoretical physicist, but also a technologist his entire career. Bob Work also has similarly been engaged in technology, has served throughout the administration as well in the Navy, and also as deputy. You have Frank Kendall, who's also a technologist. Just a number of folks who've looked at the innovation agenda as being something that's very important. Obviously, we're getting to a change of administration. If you were talking to the Trump transition team, what's the case you would make to continue the innovation agenda, and particularly to extend the life of DIUx?
Sure. I think I would look back to the fundamentals of why does something like a DIUx matter? Why does interacting in a unique way with the commercial sector and non-traditional technology companies important for national security? If you were to make a graph, to graph federal R&D for defense versus commercial R&D, historically the government was the leader in research and development. But those lines crossed in 1983, and the commercial investment is multitudes higher than the defense side. And so there are advances in certain technologies that the commercial world is doing for their own purposes. Amazon wants to deliver a package anywhere in the world using autonomous drones that can self-navigate and use computer vision. These technologies have military applications, and we need to be able to access them earlier and integrate them into our systems so we have our edge in national security. So to me, innovation, and particularly DIUx, is important so we continue to have the latest technologies and capabilities for our men and women in uniform.
What do you think are all the factors that are required for, and what is the definition of success for DIUx, right? So it's a twofold question. What constitutes success, and what do you need to succeed?
Right. So success for us is, did we accelerate innovation and capability to the warfighter? Did we make them better at their jobs? So there's a warfighting measurement that is how we are judging our success. So in order to interact with these innovation economies, and it's across the country, not just Silicon Valley and Boston, we really have to work at the speed of business. Early stage companies have normally struggled to work with the government. The processes that we use to buy an aircraft carrier are the same ones we use to buy an early piece of cybersecurity software. And so that doesn't work if the half-life of what you're buying is shorter than the time it takes to get there. And what I think we're seeing in the technology world is some types of really critical technologies are being built by small teams and small companies: artificial intelligence, machine learning, cybersecurity. And so for us to be able to access that, and access it early before that company is large and public, we need to be able to be very agile. So speed and transparency of process is number one. For example, we at DIUx, the way we've been able to attract companies to work with us that have never worked with the department before is to say, our process to engaging with you is very similar to how they would sell and engage with their commercial customers. So you're a artificial intelligence company. You help us, instead of building chatbots, help us solve some of our military problems. We're able to go from meeting that company to putting them under a contract in 60 days. Right? We've done 12 of these, an average of 59 days. That is within the speed. So that's, I think, lesson number one is agility. I think lesson number two is taking orthogonal approaches to the problems. Right? So most of these companies and these technologies are not what you would typically think that the department would have applicability for. And so when we work with our customers, and so we work very closely with the services, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, as well as the combatant commands, to help understand capability gaps, not requirements. Right? If we go with requirements, it's not adequate for these smaller companies. So we understand capability gaps and take orthogonal approaches. I can give you an example. There are several companies that have been funded for the real estate industry to do mapping of inside of buildings. Right? How's my construction doing relative to the architectural plans? They're privately funded companies using small quadcopters with low-cost systems. there units in the Special Operations Forces said we would love to have a way to be able to map the inside of a building before we do a mission. But they had some special capabilities that they needed in terms of the mapping caliber and where it could go. So we were able to fund those additional feature sets. And we were able to do that very, very quickly. So the orthogonal approaches, right, taking things that are used for something entirely different for our approaches. And I think the last one is a willingness to fail and iterate, meaning you're never, if a program is so large that you only know if you've successfully accomplished it at the end of 10 years, particularly if it's a software or a small hardware item, it's hard to calibrate along the way. So a willingness to iterate, to try some things, see things that work, see things that don't work, stop doing the ones that don't, and focus on the ones that do, is how software is developed in the real world. And so I think that's the other kind of key that a DIUx approach is unlocking capability, again, for the department.
From a speed standpoint, though, if you ask a lot of the guys in the Valley, as I'm sure they've told you, 6 months is their lifetime, right? In terms of becoming a success, hitting those funding goals, hitting the growth goals, hitting the technology goals. Their investors are extremely demanding on the progress curve because it's a very rich environment. There are a lot of people who are doing this, and many people are placing many bets. From the standpoint, and several have told me, even if they've been on boards that people in Washington would kill to be on, their point is, I can't come to Washington every 6 months to have a meeting that's no different than the meeting I had 6 months ago. It'll be no different from the meeting I have 6 months from now. So they drop off of it. It's not worth the time and the expense. How do you change that time cycle for agility? Because the Pentagon historically does not reward the first mover, right? In the Valley, you're the guy who comes up with the pot detection system. You hit gold. But if you do it for the Pentagon goes, wow, that's a brilliant idea. Now let's study it, and now let's create an RFP. Let's now have everybody compete. And so the first mover actually doesn't win. How do you change some of those fundamental tenets?
Yeah, I think those are spot-on observations, and those are exactly the challenge that we at DIUx are trying to solve. And again, we're not appropriate to go buy an aircraft carrier, but for certain technologies we are. So how do we do it specifically? One, we're enabled by some changes in the 2060 National Defense Authorization Act, which allows us to acquire and buy technologies like the private sector would. So we start with capability gaps. We resource a problem with both financial as well as HR with our customer. And only until that point do we go out into places like Silicon Valley. So here we know exactly what the problem is. We go and we find the 10 best companies that could potentially solve it. We ask them to send us their pitch deck or their standard presentation that they would use for their commercial companies. We quickly review it. The ones that pass the next screen, we bring them in, do further diligence, and then directly negotiate the contract in a collaborative fashion with them to solve it. That whole cycle, from reaching out to those companies to being able to sign that contract, again, is 60 days. And 60 days is reasonable, right? 6 months from one meeting to the next, I would agree we're not going to get those early stage ones. So the way we do it is, again, utilizing new authorities, and more importantly, having the support of the department to say, let's try something new. Let's try something that's quicker. Let's streamline our own internal processes to see if this will work. And I think the results over the last 6 months that we've been running, speak for themselves in order to show that there is a better way.
How, when Dr. Carter launched the initiative on becoming defense, or soon after becoming Defense Secretary in 2015, and if you look at the big reboot was in May. That's when you succeeded George DuCek as the director of DIUx, and it's the reboot. It was the 2.0 version. How different is 2.0 from 1.0, and what are you able to do now that you or the organization wasn't able to do before?
Yeah. I think, again, this is an example of the rapidly pivot and move and learn from your mistakes, even as an organization that the department has done. I think there was a couple elements that equipped our team to succeed in the manner that I've described, right? These 12 contracts that we've been able to get done. I think one is we brought on a team that had pre-existing relationships in places like Boston and Silicon Valley. We have a team now that's comprised of former entrepreneurs, former investors, folks that worked at large technology companies on advanced concepts. So they had the relations with the people in that own personal trust and credibility they could bring, where folks would come take a chance on us, and understandably be able to suss out between what's real and not. Right? There's just as much BS in the Valley as there is here in TEC.
No.
It just smells differently, right?
No.
And so we want to make sure we're good fiduciaries of government dollars. So having people that understand and can discern what's PowerPoint, vaporware, and what's real. So that's kind of one, the team. Two, we were resourced, right? So we have capital that we can co-invest with our partners in the services. So that allows us to, again, move things faster, provide incentives for people to join us, bridge some of the fiscal dollar types and year situations that people have. So we had resources. And then the final thing, again, is the authority to follow the law, but break through regulations or policy that perhaps were slowing things down, right? So we had authority within the building to be able to try something new. So those three elements enabled us to be successful and unlock. I think there's a burgeoning group of companies and folks around the nation that want to work with the Department of Defense. They want to work on our problems. They're the most interesting ones, the most challenging ones. They're life and death. But they really have not had the opportunity to do so because of a lack of a business case for them. And I think that's what we're really solving.
How much money are you talking about, though? Because 12 programs are great from an illustrative set standpoint.
Correct.
But you're also looking at the world's most complex military with, tens upon tens of thousands of contracts, if not more than that, at least for things and for services. How much money do you have, and how are you making an impact with the money that you do have?
Sure. So the 17 bill has us currently slotted for $30 million of R&D money plus some operations money to run the offices. So relatively modest in terms of department standards, right? We do a model where our services also co-invest in us. Maybe it's 2 to 1, 3 to 1. So still the whole the project is below $100 million annual. But I think what's really important is not the dollar figure, right? The dollar figure is enabling us to show the art of the possible and to get the prototypes going. But if we buy 2 prototypes of these drones that I described, and then the Navy said, this was great, we'd like to buy 1,000 of those for our purposes. The authorities, again, from that 16 bill, because we did the prototype, enables the Navy to use what we did as sole source justification for follow-on procurement. So then they can go buy and equip everybody. And so really what I'm trying to say, if I up-level that, is that we're trying to show cultural change, right? We are not the acquisition arm of the department. We are a way to show and demonstrate how we can engage a new group, how we can build prototypes faster, and utilize the full authorities given to us by Congress. And the idea is by showing that and demonstrating success, we'll slowly change the culture throughout the department such that for certain types of technologies, again, it's not uniform, that folks will adopt our approach and move. So I think that's the answer. So it's less about the dollar, but it's more about how the department scales the innovation, the process innovations that we're putting in place.
Of course, every place has a culture, right? So, even though I think BS flourishes in many places, including Silicon Valley, but also in the Pentagon, but historically, Washington has always looked at how much money you control
Sure.
being equivalent to the power you have.
Sure.
And so that's, sometimes from that dynamic is seen as, well, they just don't have a lot of money. In terms of short-circuiting the process, as you said, can you give us some of the examples where you guys have used existing authorities to say, look, we're trying to apply a rule of reason here to get to the right place? How have you applied the rule of reason? How have you short-circuited BS, if it's necessary, to get to the good outcome?
Sure. I think it's a couple of different ways. So for example, one of the areas that we're focused now is commercial space. So there's 5 big broad areas, which I'll cover here in a minute. But there are several companies a whole universe of young companies trying to take advantage of advances in technology in commercial space, from launch to manufacturing of small satellites, the sensors, how you analyze the data. And so we're running a project where we're going to work with several companies to show we could get high quality data for the warfighter at a fraction of the price that would normally take, such that it would be very complementary to the high-end systems that we have, but we only have so many of. We would have more ubiquitous low-end systems. But the way that we're approaching it is rather than doing a broad RFP with very set requirements and a winner and then a peer to performance, this is nascent technology. And so what we're going to do is contract with 3 or 4 companies and have technical milestone down selects and payments along the way. So as the technology matures, some companies may do better than the others, and the winners are ones that we will engage with. And they must win not just on the technology, but they also must win on their own commercial business, because we are putting, again, a modest amount relative to what their own private sector investors are. So it's a different approach, right? So I would say short-circuiting, but a different approach to say, how do we maximize the value for every taxpayer dollar that we use for the benefit of our wares, right? Normally, we pay for all of R&D when we ask a company to do this. When we're engaging with these commercial companies, there's others that are paying, and so we're getting leverage out of it.
Do you, in getting ready for this, I talked to friends of mine in the Valley and said, hey, I'm going to be talking to Raj, so what are some of the things I should be asking? And a couple of them were sort of like, hey, what's a couple of them were like, hey, what is really their role when you look at specifically, right? But it is the bridging role between these communities that don't normally, or at least we can say that over the last several decades, haven't rubbed together the way they did perhaps 50 years ago when Hewlett and Packard were coming up with computing and all of this stuff, and the department was really interested in it, and clearly a leader, and its investment was a leader in it. But what is the advice that you have for guys who do have creative, innovative ideas to bring it to the department's attention? What are the ways, you exist as, originally Dr. Carter said, it's an embassy out there. But, what's the advice you have for people who have good ideas? How do they bring it to your attention? What are the steps to, keep this engine running?
Right. So I'd say there's a couple of things. In addition to just the execution of contracting procurement role, we also have an engagement role, right? So we host a series of events, both in Silicon Valley and across the nation, about how do you work with the department? What are the areas that we're interested in? And so I encourage folks to come in and invest a little bit of time there just for education and learning. Those 5 areas, if I could briefly tell you, are autonomy, artificial intelligence, machine learning, networking and cybersecurity, commercial satellites, as well as biotechnology. These are ones where we think the commercial world is ahead. So I would say engage with us in that regard. When we have an actual project that we're working on with a customer, so there'll be some posting on our website, there'll be also other events where we'll get the word out. In that case, if we take a meeting with the company, there'll be a very clear outcome, right? It'll be either a fast no, thank you, but this is not fitting our need, which in a young startup is actually extremely valuable to understand no and why, or yes, and now here's the transparent process to get there. So again, we're small. We're not doing every project for the department, clearly, but for the ones that we do, that's our commitment to the companies we work with. And our hope is, again, over time, that these techniques will be adopted more broadly, and that the interactions that these companies have with the department will more hew to what I described than to perhaps the frustrations people have had over the last decade or two.
Do you if we said, I'm going to triple your budget and give you more than 2 people in Austin, right, and more than a handful in Boston, and more than a handful in the Valley, and I said, hey, Raj, I'm going to give you the 100 people you need, I'm going to triple your budget and give you these extra authorities, does that dramatically accelerate what you're going to be able to produce?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And I think, when we first started, if you had asked me that question 3 months ago or 6 months ago, I probably would have said, we've got enough resource as it is. Let's get this right and make sure we crawl before we run. What I've been pleasantly surprised with being in this job now for 6 months is the level of interest within the department to find alternative solutions, particularly around machine learning and intelligence, as well as the willingness of folks in these ecosystems to want to work with the department. There's broad interest on both sides. and trying to find a way to better match and marry and process-wise, I think there is a ton of opportunity. So I think today, if we were to have a significant increase in the budget, we do know the areas that we'd want to do it. 2 or 3 times what we're at now, I think is doable. I think something larger than that, I'd want to do it again very methodologically, because, again, these things are very time-intensive from a relationship, people, diligence standpoint, and we want to make sure we get them right and we're being good stewards. So certainly there's room for growth, but you have to do it in a measured approach.
Do you, there are those who look at, for example, the technology areas that you mentioned, and space is one of those things where, right, you have Jeff Bezos involved in it, you have Elon Musk involved, Maston, you have a lot of really dynamic and interesting companies that got into this staid, once considered sort of staid marketplace. And I do want to ask you about the role of the primes in this evolving and changing ecosystem. But how do you respond to those who look at the problem sets that the department is trying to work on as being sort of problematic in an environment where there's this global leveling of technology, right? I mean, that's one of the things that's driving this is the proliferation of this commercial technology. And in a world where the world's most powerful supercomputer resides in China, and the people who are running it went to Berkeley and went to Caltech and went to MIT and then ended up working with, or running the American subsidiary of a leading software or hardware company, and now work for example, a state-owned university or concern. Is it important to be focused on these areas, or do we need a fundamentally different approach for speed and innovation that doesn't necessarily get constrained to any place? Do we need to be in a better process and thinking space rather than confining and saying, okay, it's machine learning and autonomy, which the other guy can actually in some ways do as well as we can, right? There's no necessarily secret sauce there.
I think you're actually spot on. The real value here is not the actual technology, because those are always going to be changing. They're always going to be different. It's our ability to be agile, to very quickly vet and ingest new pieces of technology, because there's always going to be that next thing.
And get it out to the field quickly.
And that change is rapidly accelerating. So we, through our process standpoint, have to be able to take that latest thing, get it out to the field, have people run and train it, right? If you think about the paradigm of traditional military technologies, we spend a lot of time building something. It's very bespoke and focused what we need. There's a massive training program associated with it. So you take our troops, we train them, right? I took 2.5 years to learn how to fly this airplane and the
that's right. You were an F-16
right?
guy.
And all the electronics. Do you have a instruction manual for your iPhone? Right? When you download a new app, do you have to take a new training course? No. So that human-centered design allows you to quickly change and adopt, and that's that same kind of mindset that we have to take. And our adversaries here are not sitting still. They don't have DoD 5000 to go through if they want to put a grenade on a quadcopter and fly it at you, right? And so they
don't really care if they're killing a lot of people when they're in the training pipeline anyway.
And they have different ethics and different things, but we're the ones that are going to have to defend and face that threat, right? And that's happening very rapidly. It's happening today. So we have to be quicker and more agile in how we defend and utilize all these technologies, and they are being commoditized, right? Low-cost sensors, software, it is global. And we have to recognize that, and we have to adapt to it. And again, the difference is one of speed.
It is truly game-changing. I mean, if you consider, we used to talk about night vision and how tightly controlled it was, and now you can put I'm not making a plug for FLIR here, but like FLIR has the commercial one that just is a dongle, plugs into your phone, and all of a sudden you have uncooled night vision, which is potentially game-changing. Many of the startups have expressed a wariness of the heritage prime contractors, and I think that there's a little bit of back and forth on this, right? There are those in the heritage industry defense contractors who view this as a way of sort of circumventing them, and then there are those in the startup community who look with suspicion at the big guys who they feel are either trying to kill them or suborn them. So this is sort of a two-part question. The first part is, can the small guys, the startups, succeed without necessarily partnering with one of the giant primes, where they feel the reward things aren't set up, they feel like, hey, these big guys are just trying to steal my technology and use it against me at the end of the day. Are there mechanisms that are being set up So the little guy can actually do directly to do business directly with the Pentagon.
Right. So the 12 that I described are all direct with their to the companies that we worked with. So we didn't necessarily have to go through a prime. There was one of them though, interestingly, because you alluded to, what is the role of the defense industrial base? They play a very big role in here, right? I don't want to have the misconception that this is to the exclusion of the important base that we have. So one of the projects, it's a high-speed drone project. The platform and the sensors are built by a traditional large vendor. That is what they're very good at. There's some software, autonomy software, that we've added to it from a smaller company. And so you have a marriage of each company focusing on what they're best at. I think as we transition from prototyping to production, there are sustainment tails. There are other things that the larger companies are more equipped to do for and have those skill sets. So I think there's a large role for them. This is not an all or nothing approach, and we can marry and combine sort of the best of two different ecosystems to get to the most satisfactory answer for us.
Are you in the role of matchmaker sometimes when that's necessary?
I think it's project by project, so it's less of a directed, matchmaking or market making approach. That's really not what we're doing. But in the course of it, particularly because the customer is involved and the process, because it's a other transaction authority outside the traditional FAR-based thing, the negotiation when we're actually doing a contract is collaborative. So I can have the customer there, us there, and the vendor simultaneously discussing. And oftentimes it's the customer, meaning the Army or Navy operator, that says, if we could put these two pieces together, that'll really solve the need that they're facing on the battlefield. And we have that flexibility, right? That's what this contracting does. And so in that case, we'll have that conversation, say, would you two like to work together? The customer wants you both to do this. And that's still within the bounds of the process and the law. So it's quite flexible.
How do you, what do you want to see? I mean, the heritage contractors will say, look, we're tremendously innovative. We're working really at the cutting edge of technology. And we're also working at scale, right, which is something the smaller guys can't do, even if they do have extraordinarily exquisite in not the Bob Gates definition of exquisite, but truly like, wow, that's really a shining little jewel that you're going to add to this crown. But ultimately, what do you want to see from the big heritage contractors, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, the Northrops, the Raytheons, and as well the overseas guys, the Airbus? I mean, they have a presence. Thales, the French contractor, also has a presence in the Valley. What do you want to see from this heritage industrial base?
I think I'd like them to see that this is very valuable and a new approach for them as well. It allows them to take the great innovation that they are doing, but couple it with commercial technologies that in a few areas are rapidly taking off or outpacing again. And so I think for them to say there's a way for them to work with us in a faster manner. It's a way for them to, again, bring in some of this technology that's unique. And it makes their platforms that much more effective. So again, I think, and I think we're beginning to see that, particularly now that we've done one that includes both, that these things again are not mutually exclusive and can be of value.
You've said, and Silicon Valley prides itself on brutal, candid assessments, right? If you love me, let me know. If you don't love me, nothing personal. I just want to know. But also, you're a fighter pilot. So constructive criticism follows every single flight about what Major Shah did well and what Major Shah didn't do well. From the standpoint of DIUx, from both the startup community, the heritage community, and elsewhere, what are some of the constructive criticism you feel that you've gotten that's actually going to help steer your future course?
I think there's always lots of criticisms and ways for us to do better. I think one is we're a small team, so how do we have a broader reach? Our first office was in Silicon Valley. Our main office remains there in Mountain View. We have now a second office in Boston and now a satellite in Austin. But again, it's a pretty small physical footprint. And so one of the concerns are we getting a broad view? And I think that was fair. And the way we've addressed it is we're standing up a reserve unit that will have members throughout the nation. So if you have a reservist that's working at a Fortune 50 company in Ohio and is one of their security operators. Instead of going and driving a tank on the weekend, they do the same type of work with us, and we benefit from the knowledge that they've gained in their civilian career for years on network security and operations, and also gives us insight into technology that they've seen. So I think that's a fair one that the reserve folks are helping to address.
Assuming that they don't want to drive the tank on the weekend.
Right. Or yeah, exactly.
Because
right. There's certain
if you've driven
to
a tank, it's quite fun actually. But I take the point you're making.
Take that fighter jet, right? So I think that's one. I think the second one is right now we're focused on prototypes. Again, we're 6 months into this process. Is how does the prototypes that we build transition into larger efforts that directly impact the warfighter, right? And we are, again, not going to be owning programs of record. And I think we're beginning to see the first few of those. So there's a couple of projects where we built the prototype. The customer has said, boy, that really did solve what we needed. And now they're putting it into their POM cycle, into their outgoing years to put significant additional resources in. So I think we're just at the cusp of that. And we need a little bit more time, I think, as these first batch of projects begin to show success.
Do you, when you talk to guys in the Valley, it's amazing how often In-Q-Tel comes up in this in terms of the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of people who've sort of said, hey, look, the CIA kind of has a great model because even before DoD gets there, In-Q-Tel has already gone there, given them some seed money, disappeared, and sometimes you show up. Does there need to be better coordination among DARPA, In-Q-Tel, what you guys are doing, and then the services, of course, right? I mean, because each one of them have
Sure.
very sophisticated innovation arms as well, to sort of better synchronize this, because it's really been surprising how often, for some folks will be like, oh yeah, but the CIA has been involved in our thing from the beginning, and, and you're sort of like wonder, how did they get involved in it? But we don't want to necessarily ask that question, but.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's both sides of the equation there, and I think I can articulate both. One is more synchronization and coordination is a good thing. In fact, we are working very closely with In-Q-Tel and SCO and the services to ensure that when we're working with a particular company or area, that there is some level of coordination. On the other hand, when we talk about agility and speed, you don't want coordination to become the euphemism for slowing things down, right? So it's how you coordinate. If you can coordinate and not slow down your processes, then it makes sense. In some things, even if there's duplication, right, I think an 80% solution in 6 months might be valuable to do in addition to the full solution in 10 years, right? Because you're going to buy down risk, you're going to do some of that failing fast, and find alternative pathways. So I think arguments can be made on both sides, and it's almost, again, on a project-by-project basis.
From a national technology standpoint, there was a lot of focus on technology because the President of the United States was a technologist. Maybe he was, geek chic, as some people would say, in terms of his interest in technology and driving some of these balls forward. From a broader perspective, does the United States need to have a different national technology strategy approach? I don't want to draw Cold War parallels, obviously, but we're in a great power competition. Russia is very active. China is very active. There are pockets of technology. If you look at Iran, the North Koreans have managed to, in some ways, surprise us with the level of their technology. And then you have a series of rising powers around the world that are no technological slouches either, whether they're Brazil, whether it's India, and certainly Europe remains a technological powerhouse in this competitive world. Does the United States need a different sort of a strategy in this competitive world to ensure that it stays in the lead? Because if you look at it on many metrics, our lead is shrinking in a lot of these very important segments.
So, we in the U.S. Defense Department and the military, I speak from personal experience, have always prided ourselves that when we have to go to combat, that we have the best equipment. We have the best technological superiority, right? You don't want to have a fair fight, right? You want to have the overwhelming advantage, both in technology and the training and people that come along with that. And so I think as global trends change, as certain types of unique technologies become commoditized and more freely available, I think we cannot ignore that, right? We have to react to that, and we have to say, what are the things that are going to make us different, right? Is it how fast we iterate and how fast we bring in new technologies? Are there orthogonal approaches that we take? So I think in general, there's not any, I think, one solution or recommendation, but just broadly that we have to be honest about where we stand and be relentless in ensuring that we have the best technology and training for our folks in uniform.
And how many more DIUx franchises are necessary?
Well, we're one office. We're one DIUx. We have
Right.
multiple offices, and our focus is, again, on getting the right thing. So if we need more places to
Boulder?
achieve the mission, then we will.
Boulder?
There's lots of great places around the nation.
What are the changes, though, that you would recommend as you see, as the Congress doubtless will continue to debate acquisition reform? Mac Thornberry is as committed to it
Right.
as John McCain is to it, and they're likely to drive the process, perhaps even if the next administration chooses not to be as aggressive. Right? It looks like those guys are going to drive it. What are some of the recommendations that you have to actually streamline and further improve the entire system?
Sure.
Seeing as how you're bringing the commercial piece of it, then from your perspective, what are the things that have to happen to more institutionalize some of this?
I think the first piece, or my first kind of advice, would be there's a lot of reforms that are needed, a lot of reforms that have been discussed and on the way. There's been countless number of blue ribbon panels on acquisition reform. And I guess what I would encourage is the same way that, again, we think about software development, which is iterative, fast changes, understanding the impact, what works, and you get great customer feedback, you double down on, and the other ones you wither away, is to go ahead and start implementing the iterative changes now, right? So even what we're doing at DIUx is just one piece of that, but here's a new way of doing prototyping. Let's see, did it work? What are the results? Okay, if that was great, let's do more of that. Let's try these other pieces of reform, which enables you to go ahead and get started now. And in fact, they did that with the 16 NDAA, so much credit to both of them for putting that in the bill, and it's now bearing fruit. But not to let the perfect get in the way of the now. It is a big enterprise, and I would encourage an iterative change and support the things that are working.
Where do you have to be in 5 years? Because there isn't a Silicon Valley guy who doesn't have a 5-year plan.
5-year plan, exactly. Well, there's lots of things that could happen in 5 years. Perhaps one thing that could happen in 5 years is that the techniques that we pioneer and that have tried prove successful and are actually widely adopted throughout the department. And if that actually occurs and it changes the way we buy software, the way we think about big data, then perhaps the DIUx doesn't need to exist because the mission will have solved, right? And there'll be some new group that tries something
vision.
new. I'm a hopeful guy from the Valley.
How long will you be associated with DIUx?
I'm planning on staying here. I mean, through the transition and beyond. This has been one of the most exciting jobs I've ever had, and so we're having a blast. And as long as we're delivering value, it's a really exciting thing to do.
Have you had any transition conversations yet to try to make the case and sell the mission to the new team?
It's my first day back in D.C. post-election, so we're just getting started on that.
Well, we really hope people give you a call. And by the way, congratulations. I understand you're going to be Lieutenant Colonel Shah soon.
Yeah, soon.
So do you get back to flying at any point?
I wish. We'll see if that optimistic dream also comes true.
Raj, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Vago.